The story begins not with a bang, but with silence, the kind that stretches long over flat Midwest highways, humming like a warning no one's yet heard. It was the mid-1990s, and something cold-blooded was stirring across the heartland. Banks, quiet, brick and glass fixtures of small-town life, were being hit like clockwork, each one cracked open with surgical precision. No names. No fingerprints. No mercy. 7 states. Dozens of strikes. Hundreds of thousands gone like morning mist. The culprits? Ghosts in ski masks, silent, swift, and armed to the teeth. They moved like shadows, spoke little, and vanished before anyone could scream. But they always left behind a signature, a bomb, or something that looked like one. It was their calling card. Their threat. Their control. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, stewards of law across state lines, had seen crime waves before. But this was different. This wasn't some two-bit operation, it was a campaign. A campaign of fear. One of the Bureau's best, Jim Carlstrom, then the head of the New York field office, would later recall it with a grim tone. This wasn't about greed. It was strategy. We were dealing with a machine organized, deliberate, and dangerously anonymous. In places where crime used to mean shoplifting and the occasional drunken fistfight, violence was now entering through the front door, mid-morning, cloaked in black and shouting commands. On a bitter January morning in 1994, in the slow-moving town of Ames, Iowa, time stopped at precisely 10:30 a.m. The humdrum rhythm of small-town life was shattered when 2 figures burst into a local bank, pistols drawn and voices hard as steel. Down! All of you face the ground. It wasn't panic, it was command. The kind of authority that turns screams into silence. Their ski masks betrayed no expression. Their weapons never lowered. And yet, amidst the chaos, one cool-headed employee reached beneath the counter and hit the silent alarm. 30 miles away, at the FBI's Des Moines field office, red lights blinked to life. The Bureau's agents knew what that signal meant: another robbery, another trail gone cold before it even warmed up. Back at the scene, the masked men worked quickly. Not a second wasted. Drawers opened, cash disappeared. The heist lasted under 5 minutes, just long enough for terror to set in, but not long enough for help to arrive. Before leaving, one of them pulled out what looked like a bomb, a rough contraption of wires and red tubes taped together. Nobody moves for 5 minutes. Or you'll all be ashes. And just like that, they vanished. When the Bureau's agents finally arrived, they moved like clockwork. The bomb squad approached the crude device with a quiet, practiced dread, only to discover it was fake. Road flares, duct tape, and a psychological weapon. But the impression had already been made. People would talk. The FBI listened. Witness interviews trickled in like pieces of a torn photograph. One woman remembered a gunman leaning over the counter. Others remembered the strange silence, how calculated it all felt. There were no fingerprints. No names. Just one footprint near the teller's station, a grainy surveillance image, and a haunting clue: during the robbery, someone had barked orders in Spanish. Special Agent Ken Moore, a seasoned hand in Des Moines, read the report and leaned back in his chair. His instincts were twitching. This was an amateur hour, he muttered. This was an operation. He was right. The days ticked by, and the wind over the Midwest carried whispers of fear, of curiosity, of something darker drifting just out of sight. Then, just when the trail seemed to vanish, it surfaced again. And this time, it came with teeth. February 15, 1994, a date burned into the Bureau's ledger. Another small-town bank, this time in Davenport, Iowa, fell prey to the same invisible hand. Same black masks. Same barked orders in Spanish. Same brutal efficiency. But this time, something changed. When the robbers disappeared into the morning fog, they left behind more than fear. In the vault's corner, wired tight with menace, lay a real bomb, not a scare tactic, not a bluff, but the genuine article. The Bureau's agents, already on edge, felt the mood shift. "We're not dealing with showmen anymore," one of them said. "This is escalation." Specialists were pulled from neighboring states. Bomb technicians worked overtime, dismantling the device piece by piece. The fuse wasn't lit, but the message was clear: the game was getting bloodier. It wasn't just robbery now. It was terrorism with a blueprint. Patterns began to emerge. The FBI's behavioral unit traced the robbers' rhythm like a metronome. They struck between 10 and 11 a.m., late enough to avoid morning rush, early enough to vanish before lunch. They never lingered more than 5 minutes. They spread their attacks like wildfire across state lines, staying one step ahead of every jurisdiction. To the untrained eye, it was chaos. But to the Bureau, it was a design. "We're chasing phantoms," said Agent Moore, staring at a map riddled with pins. "But phantoms make shadows. And shadows leave trails." Spring rolled in, and with it came another hit, this time in Springdale, Ohio. This one was different. Bigger. Bolder. Over $100,000 vanished like smoke. But luck, or perhaps arrogance, cracked the first piece of armor. A witness, just an ordinary passerby, caught a fleeting glance of their getaway, a brown Chevrolet with no plates and windows rolled down. 9 days later, fate played its hand again. A security guard, patrolling a lonely lot, noticed a car that hadn't moved in days. Something inside didn't sit right: a police scanner on the seat, a pager, and a duffel bag that smelled like the bottom of a storm drain. Then he opened the glove box. A grenade rolled out. It wasn't active. But it didn't have to be. The vehicle was traced: serial number, dealership, buyer's vague description. A few loose ends, some scuffed paperwork. But no names. The road was still murky. Frustration set in. The agents could feel the pressure, not from bosses or headlines, but from the rhythm of the crimes. It was speeding up. Each robbery more aggressive. Each escape more reckless. One FBI field officer put it best. "They weren't just robbing banks anymore. They were taunting us. Pushing boundaries. Seeing how far they could go." And on December 27, 1994, they went farther than ever before. St. Louis, Missouri. A different kind of morning. For men this time. Not two. A crew, expanding like a virus. They were seen putting on masks before they even entered the bank. A bystander spotted them. So did a teller inside, who for the first time caught a flash of one of their faces. That single glance changed everything. Sketch artists were called in. Witnesses described what they saw. The FBI's composite drawings were quickly distributed to every law enforcement bulletin in the region. And with it came the surge, a tidal wave of public tips, some useful, most just noise. Then came the twist. The robbers spoke first. Letters. Drawings. Postmarked and anonymous. Sent to local papers. Taunting. Mocking. Cold-blooded artistry on lined pages. They gave themselves a name. The Midwest Bandits. The message was clear: catch us if you can. But the taunt carried something more: a scent, a flicker of arrogance. And arrogance, the Bureau knew, makes mistakes. The Midwest Bandits had crossed the line. Not just in blood or money, but in message. They weren't hiding anymore. They were performing. Sending letters. Naming themselves. Mocking the very people hunting them. For the FBI, that changed the tone. This wasn't just federal crime, this was personal. The Bureau shifted gears. Across 7 states, agents pulled every fragment of evidence, combed through stacks of witness interviews, and rewound every second of grainy bank footage. The task was monumental, but this was the FBI's arena. This was what they were built for. They called a meeting Louisville, Kentucky. Late August 1995. Representatives from every affected field office gathered in a hotel conference room turned war room. Maps, files, photographs, and timelines blanketed the walls. Special Agent Ken Moore stepped to the front and addressed the room like a general before battle. This is no longer a series of isolated incidents. This is a campaign, deliberate, ideological, and expanding. And it ends now. It was there, in the cold light of overhead fluorescence and stale coffee breath, that one file, nearly forgotten, whispered its secrets. Special Agent David Welker had been sifting through case files from Cincinnati when he found it, an anonymous tip, dated June 1994. Buried under routine leads. Dismissed at the time for lack of evidence. 2 names. That's all it said. Peter Langan. Richard Guthrie. Now, with months of robberies pointing to an organized network, those names glowed like neon in a snowstorm. Welker ran their profiles. And the lights got brighter. Langan ex-con with priors for armed robbery. Once knocked over a pizzeria with a shotgun. Military obsessed. Smart. Dangerous. Guthrie louder, more erratic. Former subject of Secret Service scrutiny after threatening a sitting president. When arrested years ago, he had a stash of grenades and semi-automatic weapons, the exact arsenal now showing up in banks. The Bureau's composite sketches were pulled out and laid side by side with old mugshots. It was uncanny. One agent said it best. It was like the artist had drawn straight from their booking photos and didn't even know it. The Bureau had names now. Real ones. Faces. Backgrounds. A direction. But the bandits, they were still ahead, staying mobile, never sleeping in the same place twice. They moved like wolves, slipping between cities and backroads, always avoiding the jaws of law enforcement. The Bureau shifted focus. If Langan and Guthrie were the architects, maybe someone in their world had loose lips. An informant. A contact. Anyone who might give up a sliver of truth. And they found one. In Georgia, an old associate of the pair, someone who had once called them brothers, agreed to talk. Reluctantly. Warily. But he talked. His words painted a picture more twisted than the Bureau expected. Peter Langan wasn't just a criminal. He was an ideologue. He saw himself as a soldier, the informant said. A revolutionary. He believed the banks were the enemy, that the government was a traitor to the people. It all began to click. Langan wasn't acting alone. He was replicating the strategy of the Order, a white supremacist group from the 80s that robbed banks to fund extremism. Langan had studied them. Admired them. He had taken the blueprint and built his own variation. He called it the Aryan Republican Army. They weren't stealing for thrills or even survival. They were financing a movement. A network. A vision of America steeped in fear. The informant added more. They used pagers and coded language. They had military-grade weapons. And most importantly, they had reach. By winter of 1995, the case was no longer just a manhunt. It was counterterrorism. Winter rolled into the Midwest like an omen, bitter, unyielding, cloaked in gray. And while the wind gnawed at the edges of small towns, the FBI was closing in on something colder still. By now, the picture was forming not just of a gang, but of a purpose. Peter Langan and Richard Guthrie weren't mere thieves, they were architects of a domestic insurgency, using the stolen spoils of Midwestern banks to bankroll a quiet war against the American government. The Aryan Republican Army, no longer a whisper, no longer a myth, was real. and the Bureau knew they were running out of time. Then came another robbery. December 1995. This time in Cincinnati. The bandits struck hard and fast, just as they always had. But for once, they didn't slip away without friction. During their escape, one of them clashed with a teenage girl. She fought back. A purse struggle. A moment of chaos. Screams on the sidewalk. Sirens in the air. Witnesses saw everything. Not enough for names, but enough to rattle the gang's rhythm. The precision was fraying. They were slipping. This was the first crack in their armor, an agent later said. They were getting reckless. And that meant they were gettable. The Bureau activated their sleeper card, the informant. The same man who'd once broken bread with Langan and Guthrie now became their shadow. They flew him into Cincinnati. Unmarked cars. Unremarkable motels. No press. No trace. The orders were simple. Find them. For a week, the man wandered through old haunts. Dead ends. Closed doors. Faces turned cold. By day 7, even the Bureau was losing faith. He's lost the scent, one agent muttered. They've gone underground. But at 2:30 a.m. on January 17, 1996, the informant made the call that changed everything. His voice was ragged from the cold. His words were simple. I found Guthrie. The moment that hit the agent's ears, the machinery of federal justice roared to life. They didn't blink. No one went home. The target was moving. The informant had seen Guthrie at a local restaurant, casual, arrogant, unaware. They spoke. Guthrie, cagey at first, warmed quickly. Old camaraderie had its uses. We're still working, Guthrie whispered. Bigger than before. We're armored up. No more games. That night, the informant fed every detail to the FBI, the van's license plate, its exact location, the weapons inside. It was a gold mine. The Bureau drew up a plan, a quiet arrest, no shootouts, no headlines. The informant arranged a meeting neutral ground, an apartment borrowed for the sting. All Guthrie had to do was show up. But criminals like Guthrie didn't survive this long by being predictable. At the last second, he changed the location. A pizza joint. The FBI scrambled. Surveillance teams fanned out. Every agent in range was rerouted, sirens off, headlights dimmed. But the convoy split in traffic. Coordination faltered. One agent found himself ahead of the rest and staring at Guthrie alone in a parking lot. The call came in. He's here. I'm tailing. No backup. No safety net. Just him, Guthrie, and the weight of a nation's case balanced on a razor's edge. The van pulled out. The chase began. Cincinnati's streets lit up with unspoken urgency. Guthrie, realizing he was being followed, pushed the gas. His van hulled through intersections, desperate for a way out. But the net was closing. He turned down a narrow alley. Dead end. The Bureau was waiting. Guthrie ditched the vehicle and ran. Fast. Desperate. But the Bureau's boots weren't far behind. At the edge of the river, he stopped, breath ragged, hand hovering near his hip. FBI, the agent shouted. Don't do it! Guthrie stood there, the winter wind curling around him like a noose. For a moment, he was weighing something, a firefight, maybe. A last stand. Then he raised his hands. They got him. No blood. No glory. Just cold steel on his wrists and silence in the wind. Richard Guthrie was finally in federal custody. The man who once believed he could vanish between state lines now sat beneath flickering lights in an FBI interrogation room, surrounded by agents who knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. They didn't push him. They didn't have to. The Bureau played the long game, no shouting, no pressure. Just silence, space, and the weight of his own choices. And it worked. Guthrie started to talk slowly at first, then like floodgates cracking open. He handed over his pager, the encrypted codes he and Langdon used to communicate, and hints about their next rendezvous. But he was sly, even then. He said the meeting would be in Indianapolis. The Bureau nodded but didn't believe him. They played along, even set up a fake sting operation in the Indiana capital, while agents close to Guthrie built trust, tapping into his interests: firearms, flying machines, the mechanics of control. And somewhere between idle talk and subtle ego strokes, Guthrie let something slip. Columbus. Not Indianapolis. That was the real target. January 18, 1996. The Bureau's Special Operations team descended quietly on a modest house tucked into a quiet Columbus neighborhood. Unassuming. Deceptively normal. Parked outside, Langdon's van. The strategy was simple: let him get in, make sure he was boxed in, and move before the ignition turned. At 9:30 a.m., the door creaked open. Langdon stepped into the morning chill, carrying a cloth bag, heavy, purposeful. He always carried, an agent later said. We assumed the worst. He entered the van. And just sat there. Motionless. The agents waited, breath held, triggers readied. Then the call came through the radio. Go! Now! Vehicles surged. Tires shrieked. Doors slammed. Agents surrounded the van from every angle. Guns up. Commands shouted. Inside, Langdon didn't move. Seconds passed, each one heavier than the last. Then, slowly, his hands rose. Open. Empty. They had him. Inside the van was a small armory: grenades, loaded pistols, boxes of ammunition, ski masks, even hats emblazoned with the letters FBI, twisted trophies of a deranged war. The bag he'd carried held a 9mm, identical to those used in the robberies. But it was the house that told the true story. Behind the modest siding, they found the bones of a domestic insurgency. Bomb-making components. Forged IDs. Radical propaganda. Recruitment pamphlets for the Aryan Republican Army. And a videotape. Not a confession. Not evidence of robbery. It was recruitment. A home-brewed propaganda reel meant to inspire a new generation of white supremacist militants. The voice on it was calm. Almost seductive. Today we take over America. Tomorrow, the world. The Bureau had heard these kinds of words before in darker corners, from fringe movements. But never this close to home. Langdon refused to speak. Silent. Smug. But they didn't need him to talk. In Columbus, a bank employee, a woman who had glimpsed the robbers more than a year before, identified him from a photo lineup without a blink. It was enough to nail the case. And back in his cell, Guthrie kept talking. For days, he spun a detailed web: dates, disguises, getaway plans, the cities they'd struck and the banks they'd bled dry. 99 pages of testimony. Hour by hour. He remembered everything. Except the real names of their accomplices. The gang had operated like a terrorist cell. Aliases. Compartmentalization. No one knew the full picture. But he gave the FBI breadcrumbs. A man named Scott, connected to music. Another, Kevin, whose uncle was a cop. The Bureau followed the trail east to Philadelphia. Thousands of officers in the region. Countless Kevins. But one name rose to the surface. Kevin McCarthy. connected to extremist circles, and tied to a man named Scott Stedford, a musician and, as it turned out, a getaway driver. The noose tightened. The FBI had almost everyone. But fate had one more twist left in its deck. With the Midwest Bandits finally cornered, the FBI was ready to deliver justice. Langdon sat in a federal cell. Guthrie was cooperating. McCarthy and Stedford were in custody. The Bureau had chased shadows across 7 states, and now, the light was winning. But nothing about this case had ever gone clean. Richard Guthrie, once a ghost in a ski mask, now sat behind bars as the case's linchpin, the man who remembered everything. His 99-page confession tied every robbery together, like nails hammered into a coffin. And then, just when it seemed nothing could stop the trial from unfolding, he was gone. July 3, 1996. The guards found him alone in his cell. Dead. A homemade noose. A quiet end. No witnesses. No note. Just silence. It hit the Bureau like a punch to the ribs. Their star witness, their guide through the web, had vanished into the void. No testimony. No cross-examination. Just the echo of his own voice in pages they could no longer use in court. It was a disaster, one prosecutor admitted. He was the spine of the case. And suddenly, that spine cracked. The FBI, stunned but not defeated, pivoted fast. They turned back to Kevin McCarthy, the reluctant accomplice who had once stayed silent. This time, they showed him the full breadth of Guthrie's statement. Line after line. Robbery after robbery. There was no room to hide. McCarthy folded. He agreed to testify. And with him came the next domino. Mark Thomas, the ghost behind the ghosts. A man of ideology, not action. He hadn't held a gun in a bank, but he had held Langdon's mind in the palm of his hand. A propagandist. A recruiter. A quiet architect of extremism. He had mentored them. Fed their vision. Supplied the dogma. Now, the Bureau turned its full weight on him. Unmarked cars lingered outside his home. His phone buzzed with questions. His mailbox filled with subpoenas. And eventually, like most men not built for pressure, he broke. He agreed to talk. With his testimony, the final brick slid into place. Peter Langdon, the mastermind, was found guilty of armed bank robbery and sentenced to life in prison. Scott Stedford, the wheelman and accomplice, received 29 years. Kevin McCarthy, the youngest, and the most cooperative, served 5. Mark Thomas, the voice behind the movement, was sentenced to 9.5. And the Aryan Republican Army, a group born in shadows, fueled by hate, and disguised as criminals, was dismantled, piece by piece. But even in victory, the FBI never called it closure. They had cracked the case, yes, followed footprints through smoke and dust, caught men who thought they were ghosts. But what they found at the heart of it, the propaganda, the bombs, the quiet vision of violence, reminded them of something colder. That extremism doesn't always wear a uniform. It sometimes hides in a van parked on a quiet street, or behind the smile of a man who once sang in a band. This wasn't just bank robbery, one agent said. This was domestic terrorism. And it's still out there. Just waiting for a new name. The case was closed. But the silence it left behind still echoes in the walls of the Bureau, a hum that reminds them. Even shadows leave footprints.